Back again with another camera review. This time I'm looking at the Nikon D3000. Going back a bit in time now, we're a pre-2010 era, so we're using the CCD sensor. As usual, the main features and key spec are up on screen. Then I'll be taking a body tour and just taking a look at the image quality overall with this camera. As this was positioned lower down in the price range, they do have a sort of simplified control layout. It's a very small camera for a DSLR. Large mode dial on the right hand side that has quite a few different settings, including scene modes. There's your info button and exposure compensation button next to the on-off switch and shutter release. There's a socket for the AV out and a mini USB plug. Taking a look at the back of the camera now, you can see we've got the traditional 4 buttons on the left hand side, very similar to other cameras from Nikon. Some of those buttons do have double functionality. For example, the plus button is the I button as well, and that brings up some menus. As far as the eye cup goes, that's quite an unusual design really. It's sort of quite shallow, it doesn't have much depth. It's one of the weaker points on the design. It seems like an afterthought really. The directional pad, that is useful for moving around the menu system and also changing the focus points. Just the one dial on the back next to the AEL button, so you'll have to hold down the exposure compensation in manual mode to switch between the shutter and aperture settings. On the front there's the AF assist light. There's also a self timer lamp. You'll also notice looking at the lens mount that it doesn't have the built-in focus motor, so you won't be able to autofocus with screwdriver lenses on this model. Nikon have this airflow control system. That is basically just holes at the bottom there, which is supposed to help keep dust off the sensor. Pop-up flash button also doubles up, and we have a function button with a self timer. You do have fairly limited flash modes on this camera. That is something to bear in mind, particularly in terms of high-speed sync. It doesn't support that. This era of time we moved over to the SD cards, and that may be more convenient for most people. But do bear in mind that it will only support cards up to 32 gigabytes. The larger cards, if you put them in, they don't work at all. On the underside now, we're looking at the battery compartment. This has one of Nikon's designs where you sort of open it up and the battery is sort of held in place until you pull it out. We've seen that on a few other cameras that they've done as well. Although it isn't a huge capacity battery, it does have a fairly decent rating. They're giving it 550 shots for SIPA. Bear in mind that does include flash use for every other shot. Overall build quality though is very good, despite the fact it's made out of plastic. It does feel quite solid in the hand. Comfort wise is pretty good, although I do have somewhat larger hands. I find it a little bit on the small side. They do have a built-in sensor cleaning function which you can turn on if you want to. You have a choice of a normal display or the simplified one with the graphic settings. For example, you can see when you turn the mode dial, you can also see the aperture blade shut down in size. It's designed to be more beginner friendly for someone so they can actually see what's going on. If you press the I button, that lets you get into the control panel as such on the back, so you can go through the settings and change the different ones that you want. The button above that is the question mark, and as obviously you'd expect, it does give you a bit of an explanation about the setting that you're changing. With the guide mode, that's a sort of specialized setting on the dial that you set, and once you go into the operations on the menu, you see you just pick what you want to do and it will change the camera settings to that for you. It's really for someone who doesn't have much experience with photography, but they know, for example, they want to do a macro shot, or possibly things like sports and action. Like a lot of the features with these cameras, you don't have to use it if you don't want to, so you can quite easily skip that. But I'm glad that they did include it, because some people might find it useful to actually see on screen some of the information about the modes or the particular type of photography that they want to do. A couple of annoyances though in the playback. We're back to the old Nikon. You have to keep pressing the plus button to zoom in to check focus. You can't do a single button press to get 100% view. Never understood why Nikon did that, but you have to sort of put up with that if you're used to going in and zooming in on images. You can also set the camera for an RGB histogram and more detailed settings information. Straightforward operation. There are retouch options as well if you want to go in and crop. I'll just go through the menus quickly just to show you those. They're fairly consistent across other cameras from Nikon. There are less options in this than some of the more expensive cameras, but that's down to the fact that it's a more entry geared model. You probably won't need to go into the main menus that often because you're largely going to be using that I button and the control panel. Do note that for the auto ISO, it's a sort of minimum shutter speed setting. You don't have a focal length aware option on this camera. That's something that they added later on. Other things like the mirror lockup, they're basically just for cleaning. That isn't a mirror lockup for taking pictures. A bit of a shame they didn't include that because that can be quite useful for macro photography. This was sort of typical behavior from some camera makers where they just sort of cut out most of the advanced functions. But for some strange reason, even something as simple as exposure bracketing, that's also been taken out of the camera. You don't have any bracketing at all. I mention these things just in case because they may or may not be important to you. Similar to the Sony and Minolta cameras, if you turn them to the vertical position, it does turn the display around. Although unfortunately the control panel doesn't change, but you can pick from a number of different colours depending on what your tastes are. Let's take a look at the optical viewfinder. We have the 11-point focus system, and it's a bit smaller than the Canon and Sony cameras that I've looked at. I've just put some of the information up on screen for you so you can see that. There's no continuous ISO in the viewfinder either. They just have an auto ISO indicator. We'll take a look at some of the image quality tests now, at the high ISO in particular. And that 10 megapixel CCD sensor isn't bad, particularly at around ISO 400 and ISO 800. There's a bit of noise, but nothing too dramatic. There's an obvious increase at 1600, but where things start to really get quite noisy is at the highest setting of 3200. It's not unusable, but you will have to put a bit of work in at the top ISO setting. It's somewhat better than the Sony cameras, probably because the exposure is a much brighter image that the Nikon gives. But we do have a bit of an issue with hot pixels. You can see a few of them there on the image. Nikon's active delighting does make quite a big difference to the overall image. But because it does affect the exposure, that means even if you shoot RAW, then it will make a difference to those images as well. What it does is it does bring those highlights down a bit, it adjusts the metering, it also boosts up the shadows, but it does slow the camera down in the continuous shooting mode quite a bit, so do bear that in mind. We'll have a listen to the shutter now. In terms of the images that come out of the camera, they're quite pleasing, although I did note that they can be a bit on the cool side sometimes. So a quick adjustment can fix that. You can do that in camera or in post. Also noted that in the matrix metering it is pretty consistent, but it tends to be on the brighter side. It's usually not that much. I didn't see any big swings in terms of inconsistent exposure like the Canon 450D, but it does meter a little bit on the bright side for me. It might be worth adjusting that down a little bit if you want to, either in camera or in post-processing. With this shot you can see that the orange top, it's a bit on the bright side for me, so I've just dropped it down a little bit and pulled the highlights in. Found the flash exposures to be pretty consistent as well, haven't seen any obvious problems with that. It will ramp down the power, particularly for things like closer up shots. I prefer the look of this camera to something like the D80, at least the default profile. I thought that was very saturated on that model. It's much more pleasing and natural on this camera. I find the images from this a bit easier to work with than the Sony ones that I've looked at with the same CCD sensor. I think that's probably down to the fact that Nikon is giving a brighter exposure. Autofocus system is quite respectable really for a budget entry-level camera. It's certainly not an action camera by any means, but it did a reasonable job. I was doing some shots here with some water sports training. Have a few complaints or weaker points to mention.
What's bothering you?
I don't know, something smells bad.
The first point is the lack of controls really. You do have that programmable function button, But that's about it really. There's no dedicated control for the ISO or drive modes. And that's a bit of a shame really, because you do end up diving into that control panel quite a bit. The flash is quite limited on this camera, even with an external dedicated unit. There's no high-speed sync. If you're using fill-in flash outside at faster apertures, you're going to have to use an ND filter to work around that shutter speed limitation. Those are the main ones. There's a few other ones that I have listed out in the pros and cons section. This is quite a simple camera, and some people might like that. If you're looking for something more sophisticated, more controls, larger viewfinder, then the D90 is a good model to look at. But if you're just looking for something small, simple and pretty cheap, these are pretty affordable now on the used market, the D3000 isn't a bad little camera really. If you have any questions or thoughts on this camera, do drop a comment below. I'm always happy to help. As usual, thank you for watching. I do appreciate it, and I hope to see you in my future videos.